Hello my witches and welcome back to my channel. My name is Neyah for those of you who are new, and I'm a natural born Italian witch and psychic. And on this channel I like to talk about topics like tarot, pick a card, and witchcraft, spirituality, and so much more. And in this video we're going to talk all about the Book of Shadows. What is exactly the Book of Shadows and how to create yours. Since there are so many videos about this subject, it's definitely not an original topic. But at the same time, due to my traditional upbringing, because I was born in a family of witches, I want to bring you everything that you need to know about the Book of Shadows, along with my personal experience and how can you do yours too. In fact, I have divided this video into this following point. Point number 1, what is originally the Book of Shadow. Point number 2, where the term comes from and all its evolution. Point number 3, how it is used today, the Book of Shadows, and my personal experience. And point number 4, last but the most important, how can you use it too and how you can create your own Book of Shadows. The timestamps are going to be down below, so I highly suggest you to watch the entire video, but in case you are in a rush and you just want to skip directly to the point that you're interested in, the timestamps are down below, so you can just skip ahead and go to your favorite point. And I'm going to get started with point number 1, the origin of the Book of Shadow. We cannot talk about the Book of Shadows if we don't talk about the father of Wicca, Gerald Gardner, which coined the term in the late 1940s, and also about Doreen Valiente that contributed to the original Book of Shadows in the late 50s. But at the same time, we cannot really talk about the Book of Shadows if we don't talk about Italian witchcraft as well as ancient traditions that stem from all over the world, from Asia to Italy to the entire European country. It is in fact Gerald Gardner that, as a member of his coven and high priest, the Bricketwood Coven in England, that introduces for the first time, probably in the 50s, to initiate his first Book of Shadows. And as we know, and as is written in his famous book Witchcraft Today, with the introduction of historian Margaret Murray, the Book of Shadows has originally known by Gerald Gardner, that you can even find it on Amazon, like there is a copy available for everybody to read, couldn't exist if Gerald Gardner didn't took it from the ancient tradition that he said were coming from Italy and they were coming from Europe at large. In fact, Wicca, the religion that he founded, and especially the one that stems from him, which is the Gardnerian Wicca, comes from a mix of tradition from ancient times as a revival of the ancient religion. When we were talking about ancient religion, we were talking about from shamanism, from Sanskrit, some of the Sanskrit scriptures. We were talking about the Celts, the Druids, and very much importance it is on my tradition, which is Italian witchcraft. In fact, according to the Murray, Gardner takes a lot from the Italian witchcraft in order to compose for the first time the Book of Shadow. But the terminology in and of itself of the Book of Shadows was coined primarily by Gerald Gardner, as well as the terminology grimoire, which is well known in modern practice of witchcraft today. And what is very important to understand when we're talking about modern witchcraft, and we're talking also about Wicca, that is a religion in and of itself, is that many things that we find in Wicca are found in Italian witchcraft. In fact, I want to do in this origin of the Book of Shadows a bit of a parenthesis about my tradition and Italian witchcraft. Italian witchcraft comes and stems from the Roman Empire, especially from the gods and goddesses of the Roman Empire that survived through the ages even after Constantine and Christian Revolution. In fact, women and men were still practicing the ancient religion in Italy, and even tarot, even though so many people sustain that tarot was born in France, in actuality, tarot as we know it today were born in Italy as a parlor game in the noble family, and and later on found their occult connotation in France, because Italy was the land of the Romans, and the Romans, being pagan, were so into rituals. In fact, when we're talking about magic in and of itself, we are talking about any practices that includes visualization, rituals, and energy. So it kind of makes me laugh when people nowadays think that they are working the law of attraction and they are not playing magic. It's just a matter of perspective. But back in those days, when something was due because of Christianity, it was called a miracle, even though it was done in the same energetic way. But if it was done by pagan people, it was called the work of the devil. Because remember, history is written by who wins and never by who loses. And that's why stregoneria and Italian witchcraft always had a bad connotation after the Roman Empire. But what Gardner took by this witchcraft is the representation of the gods and the goddesses, and the fact that even in ancient time during the Roman Empire, what happened was the high priests and high priestesses especially were finding each other in rituals dedicated most of the time to Apollo or the god Dionysus, and they were dancing and celebrating life by making these rituals. Later on, through the forests and the villages of Italy and throughout Europe, these cults still existed, dedicated to the divine feminine, the goddess, dedicated to the divine masculine, the god, and other pantheon of gods and goddesses. What is very important is that many of these gods and goddesses also come from the ancient Greek tradition. In fact, one of the most important goddesses of the Italian temple is Diana, associated with the moon. As we know, she's also an ancient Greek goddess. And if you go in my Patreon, you will also see how some of these gods and goddesses are also related to the ancient Egyptian goddesses and gods. So as we can see, the world at large has contributed to the connotation of witchcraft as we know today, and also to the importance of the Book of Shadows. What we know about Italian witchcraft is the fact that later on in the years, in order to survive the Christian persecution and Inquisition, they transformed the ancient gods and goddesses into saint and the Mother Mary. And still nowadays in Italy, witchcraft or stregoneria is practiced through the use of archangels, angels, saint like Sant'Antonio, and all possible signs of Christianity. Now, I don't follow necessarily this sort of transformation because in my family and for what I know, we have been taught to worship the goddess, to worship the moon and the original pagan gods. In fact, many of my spells that I have over here on this channel, but also on my Patreon, are all revolved around Roman gods and goddesses like Mercury or like even Venus and all the planets. I work a lot with this energy because I consider that as the original tradition of Italy, among other bits and bobs that I'm going to explain you in this video. And this is where also Gerald Gardner takes with Doreen Valiente all this information, and also with Margaret Murray, the historian, all the information to validate the theory that he was remodernizing the ancient cult and the ancient religion of witchcraft and of this world. In fact, when he introduces the first and original Book of Shadows to his initiate, he says and claims that he owns the original copy of the first Book of Shadows or Gospel, and that it stems from a very ancient time and a very ancient land. In fact, what many people don't know about the Book of Shadows compared to what we see in The Craft, the movie, or what we saw around in other movies throughout the 90s probably, is that the Book of Shadows was a one original book, and that was the only book for only one coven, in this case Gerald Gardner and Doreen Valiente coven. But later on, when Doreen Valiente in the late 90s 50s becomes the high priestess, she confronts Gerald Gardner and says, well, I think you have taken this book not necessarily for where you're claiming. You are taking this book, first of all, from an article from a palmist called Mr. Bashir that talks about a Sanskrit divination manual that teaches how to foretell the future according to the length of the shadow. And that is why he called Gardner the Book of Shadows. And also she says, you're taking a lot of this information, rituals and beliefs from the Ordos Templi of Aleister Crowley, as well as the Gospel of Aradia, and a lot of Freemasonry rituals and beliefs. Gerald Gardner, after this confrontation with Doreen Valiente, admits the truth and says, yes, it's true, I've been highly influenced also by Crowley. And so Doreen Valiente says, I can do a better job than this. I think that there is a better option for our Book of Shadows, and therefore challenges Gardner in rewriting the Book of Shadows, because for Doreen Valiente was important to maintain intact the traditional, genuine witchcraft practices of the Old Age, that for her, according to her, stems especially from the Gospel of Aradia and from Italian witchcraft and the old religion at large found throughout Europe, like we were saying before. And because of this reason, she rewrites the entire Book of Shadow and includes inside the Book of Shadow, that later on she will confirm with Gardner, the Rede. The Rede is the law of every Wiccan. And on the contrary of Italian witchcraft and stregoneria, that doesn't necessarily have any laws. In fact, for Italian witches, especially at that time, there wasn't a concept between white magic or black magic, but the moral compass was due to the personality and the intention of the witch, but everything really was allowed. So Gerald Gardner with Doreen Valiente implements in the Book of Shadows a law that every Wiccan has to respect, that has very moral standard and can be summed up, even though I read the entire Rede in my video called New Age and Wicca that you guys can watch, but basically it can be summed up in one word: do what thou will, as long as it harms none. And we see also this exact same sentence in many Aleister Crowley's book. But here is the thing that it's very fundamental for the beginning of Wicca and the Book of Shadows. Doreen Valiente considered very negative the teachings and the rituals of Aleister Crowley, because it was very experimental and he was also working with demonic forces, and therefore for her was super important to take away all the beliefs that stems from Aleister Crowley and replace it with the Key of Solomon and the Gospel of Aradia and the genuine information about witchcraft as it was practiced back in those days. And that's why we need to give a separate chapter to the Gospel of Aradia. The Gospel of Aradia, or also called the Witch's Gospel, is one of the most important books when it comes about Italian witchcraft. I have read that book when I was a little child, and even though many people think that that book and the story of Aradia itself, it's merely a legend, well, let me tell you something. There could be any Book of Shadow, any modern witchcraft, that legend didn't exist. And in my perspective, Aradia was a true figure in ancient Italy. Maybe she didn't have that name necessarily, but she really existed and is not just a legend. And because of the Gospel of the Witches, we have what we know today as the Book of Shadows. So it's tremendously important to understand what is Aradia, who is Aradia, the goddess, and what it is exactly the Gospel of the Witches. As we probably know, in witchcraft, there isn't something like the Bible, and not even in ancient Egyptian magic or in any magic in and of itself, especially before Gardner, because the Book of Shadows or Gardner and his coven becomes a sort of gospel. All we know is this folklore documents put together by Leland, a folklorist of the 1899, that put together these documents about the legend of Aradia. Charles Godfrey Leland used to live in Florence for quite a long time, and it is in Florence that he meets Maddalena, or actually known as Maddalena Talenti, a famous witch that says to have the original copy of the Gospel of Aradia. And it's through Maddalena Talenti that Leland finally has the copy of the Gospel of the Witches, where all the ancient ancient religion practices were collected. Florence is based in Tuscany, and Tuscany was also the land of Caterina de' Medici, which was a very, very well-known witch throughout Florence and the Medici family, and she was also well known to be friend with, guess who? Nostradamus. And also, I do come from Florence, and everybody in Florence know how much of an occult town it is. And it is in Florence and in Tuscany where Aradia is from. But who is exactly Aradia? Aradia was considered the daughter of Diana, an incarnation of the goddess herself, and the first witch, the first living witch that walked the planet Earth, and taught the peasant how to rebel over the oppression of the feudal and the Roman Catholic Church. She was an heroine for the poor and the oppressed, and she taught witchcraft to the men and the women of Italy. And that's why Gerald Gardner, that knew about the legend of Aradia, was highly fascinated by it, highly fascinated by the cult of the gods and the goddesses and the goddess, and especially of Diana, and took from the Gospel of Aradia the modality of writing for his famous Book of Shadows, among with also the Key of Solomon, which I'm going to touch on briefly on this video. And in regards of Aradia, what is important to know is that in the Gospel of Aradia that you can find anywhere on Amazon, it's a document. It's written exactly how witchcraft was taught to these men and women back in ancient time. How to draw upon the moon, how to do spells, how to call upon Diana, and how to call the energies of the earth. And all of this gospel was fundamental for Wicca later on in the 50s as well, thanks also, like we were saying before, to Doreen Valiente. Also, the Gospel of Aradia, even though it has some opposition from some scholars, thanks to Margaret Murray, the historian, and other scholars, is still used as an evidence that documents the folklore of the Italian Stregoneria and the Italian tradition, as well as the tradition of witchcraft in Europe as a large. As we know, Wicca doesn't necessarily only stems from the Gospel of Aradia, but stems also from very ancient religion throughout Europe that comes from paganism. That's why it is considered by some, especially Gardnerian Wicca, neo-paganism. Now, talking about the Key of Solomon, I have dedicated an entire video on Solomon's seals, and I highly work with Solomon magic. Solomon was a wizard, was a witch, and was one of the most intelligent, wise, and powerful people that have walked this planet, and has studied witchcraft and magic for so long. In fact, when we're talking about the Book of Shadows, we have to mention Solomon, and we have to mention the Lesser Key of Solomon, especially for those practitioners who are at the beginning. Now let's talk about the chapter about the contemporary use of the Book of Shadows. Alright, you guys, if you made it this far, well, thank you for listening to some historical background about the Book of Shadows, because I think it's highly fundamental to know our history, since it's the history of our humanity at large. But now let's talk about the contemporary use of the Book of Shadows. The Book of Shadows, as we were saying before, usually was only one book that was given to the entire coven, and we only have an original copy. Now, if you're working within a coven, most likely what it's gonna happen is that the high priest and the high priestess of the coven retain the original Book of Shadows with all the beliefs, rituals, and rules of the coven, and then another copy, a personal copy, is given to the initiate, and that personal copy is the recall of astrology, herbs, crystals, and personal practices. This is usually how it's done in tradition. I got past my Book of Shadows and then I created my own, and therefore it's a pass on through generation depending on the coven, or it could be passed on through the family if the coven is in the family. But obviously, if you are a solitary witch, that doesn't mean that you cannot have your own Book of Shadows. In actuality, as we see throughout modern eclectic witchcraft, many many girls and men out there create their own rules, and they create their own book of shadows as a personal journal that contains their personal experiences, as well as astrology, tarot, divination, recalls, and personal spells. And this is my point number 4, and probably what you came here to know: how you're gonna do your own book of shadows if you are a beginner or a solitary witch. Now, I assume that you are a solitary witch or a beginner if you're watching this video. Therefore, you have an amount of possibilities when it comes down to create your personal book of shadows. And I want to share my personal experience a little bit in this part of the video to empathize with you guys, or this is my hope. Every single time that as a teenager, after I got my own book of shadows from my mother and I knew about their own traditional witchcraft, I'm a bit of a rebel. I wanted to do things my way, and actually I resonated a lot more than the traditional Italian witchcraft. Even though I highly appreciate that upbringing, I resonated a lot with Wicca, and I was doing a lot of research on Wicca, so I wanted to have my own personal journal. But every time I used to go on YouTube, even back then, or online in some vlogs, I used to see all this like supremely expensive books or super detailed books from people that had their own book of shadows and they were sharing it. And when I was a teenager, I really didn't have the money to buy a really expensive big book, or I just couldn't find it here in Italy that easy. In fact, I found only cool stuff when I moved to Dorset, England, way later on throughout my life. So, and also, let's be honest, I'm a Taurus. I was a bit of a lazy witch. So if you are like me, what you can do? Well, you have two possibilities to build your own book of shadows. You can either use technology and have an electronic book of shadows, or you can use any type of journal that you prefer. I tried both methods when I was in high school, or even prior to high school. I had a computer and a mobile phone, even though we're talking about the early 2000s, and I tried to have an electronic book of shadows when unfortunately my computer broke and I lost all my spells, and I thought that for me really wasn't working out, especially because again we are talking about the early 2000. And so my best friend in high school, she gave me this really cute book that I also saw on Amazon, so you probably can find it cheap anywhere. And since I was 16, this is my book of shadows. As you can see, it's nothing super fancy or anything like you see on TikTok, or I mean, if you are creative and you want to do like a supremely good looking book of shadows, you can absolutely do that. And this is up to you, but don't get discouraged if you think that your normal, I don't know, Hello Kitty journal cannot be your book of shadows. Anything that you give power to in terms of energy and you consecrate to the god or the goddess or to the universe at large can become your book of shadow. And this will be your own personal journal. But before going deeper on how to create your book of shadows, one thing I must tell you. Since you probably don't belong to a coven, or at least not yet, my suggestion before you have your own book of shadows, or in contemporary of having your own personal journal, is to put at least in your library 3 books that are fundamental. The first book is the Gospel of Aradia. Remember, the Book of Shadows as we know it today, and as I said in the historic part of this video, stems from the Aradia Gospel. So reading that book is highly fundamental to understand the Book of Shadows and the belief of witchcraft at large, as well as having the Lesser Key of Solomon to understand the planets, the gods and the goddesses, and the magic behind the original Book of Shadows. And also, last but not least, you could read the Gardner famous and notorious book Witchcraft Today. Once your library will have at least these 3 books, then you will be ready to have your own personal book of shadows. Now obviously this is just simply my advice to beginner witches, because I highly believe in history in this sense, culture and sources, but it's completely up to you. Of course, there is nothing wrong wrong in doing straight away a journal that will become your book of shadows, and has many people say in the Wicca community, in Wicca there is an exception to everything, as well as in witchcraft. So once you will have your journal, what I personally did and what I personally obviously suggest is to consecrate the book and cleanse it. You can do it with sage, you can do it with salt, or you can do it with a ritual. Probably I'm going to share a ritual to consecrate and to cleanse all your items in my Patreon, and I also have a dedicated video called the Beginner Witch Kit to understand also what you will need apart from the Book of Shadows. Once the book is consecrated and cleansed, what I did when I was a teenager, I have dedicated the first page of the book to the god and the goddess and the elements of the universe, with the symbol of the goddess Diana and the symbol of the pentacle. The pentacle is a very important symbol for witches, as I said in my video, the sigils of Solomon and Solomon's magic is very important because the pentacle represents the fourth element of the universe and this earth, which are air, fire, water, and earth, and the akasha, which is the spirit, and is a symbol of the universe at large. So I have made a ritual in my first page, a spell to consecrate the book, and in the other pages I have a devotion to the god and the goddess, like I was saying before, as well as fundamental rules on how to draw the circle, how to evoke the god, how to evoke the goddess, because when I was doing it as a teenager, when I was 16, let's remember that this book will pass on through my generation. So I was thinking, if I will ever have a daughter or a son, they will have to know the basic step of witchcraft, and these are the basic step of witchcraft. Understand how to draw the moon, understand how to draw the circle, drawing down the moon, draw the circle, the gods and the goddesses, and so much more, as well as some information about to call the cardinal points, protection magic, and all sorts of spells that I wrote that I know will work, my favorite crystals, the meaning of the runes, and how to work the runes. I recollect everything in the Book of Shadow, in my own personal journal, that I think can pass on through generation. And funny story is that according to the Italian tradition and the European tradition at large, and even Gerald Gardner knew about this, he knew that once a witch is dead, also her book of shadow or his book of shadows needs to be burned. Because in ancient times, if the book of shadows was found by people who were profane to the craft, obviously the witch and his or her family would have been discovered and would have been a massively dangerous for them. But right now, as we know, we can pass it on through generation. And in your book of shadows, you can really paint it in your own personal way, but what I will suggest you to write down, it's the very basic spells, especially at the beginning of your craft, that you know 100% will work. Now, I know for a fact that many witches have their own personal way to write the Book of Shadows, and many witches write everything that they experiment as a proper journal, but this is not what I have been taught, and this is not where I'm coming from. I had other different books that I used to write my experiment and to see whether or not a spell is working now or some divination might have worked or not. In my own personal Book of Shadows, I only write spells that I know 100% are effective. And also my Book of Shadows, it's becoming my Patreon page that was before my membership, because in my Patreon I am sharing all the spells that I know have been working effectively for me for years, and they have been passed on through my generation. So my Patreon, at the end probably of my career in social media, will be a digital Book of Shadows. And I am super excited for the people who are joining this membership on Patreon with me, because they are doing this journey with me as a community, as a little coven in a way, a very free coven, and I find it really, really exciting. So my suggestion is to write everything down that you feel has worked for you, including some of the divination that you might have done with the tarot tarot, pendulum crystal, Ouija board, whatever method you had, that in your opinion have become accurate. In fact, I have a dedicated video called My Prediction Came True, where I read from my book of shadows. If you guys want to watch it, I'm going to leave the link down below. And as you can see, this is a tarot that I did in 2018 that has been working out and was very accurate, that I also share in that video. I also share things that didn't work out, that I warned people or my future generation about. I have write down everything, a lot of spells I have write down in this book, and also I have a lot of invocation and incantation to draw gods and goddesses to me. I have warnings about using and recalling the spirit of the dead that I have experimented, and you find in my video about paranormal activities. I have my favorite dates and date in order to do spells. I also have written like a song that you can find in my band, Psychedelic Witchcraft, called The Warrens, and I wrote my favorite song because it was dedicated to one of my favorite movies called The Conjuring, and from a real living couple called the Warrens, which were acting as seekers of the supernatural. If you guys know who the Warrens are, comment down below. And all of those things. There are some witches who divide their book of shadows in many sectors and chapters. Like they have a chapters for the herbs, a chapter for astrology, a chapter for spells, and in fact you see like massive book of shadows. This is completely up to you guys. I'm a very lazy witch and I'm very, very simple, so I like to keep things very, very narrowed down and simple and effective. But this is obviously only my personal way of doing. Sometimes I put magic powders in my book of shadows in order to consecrate them and energize them, because my book is being energized and consecrated in a circle, so it holds a lot of energy. And one of the last spells that I have is a spell that an exorcist gave me for pushing away negative energy, and it's in Latin. And obviously I believe that occult as a terminology means the knowledge of the ancient ones, and therefore I write very powerful spells, especially later on. Now that I'm a bit older, I write very powerful spells in my book of shadows, and that's why I do not share them all with the public, but more in private platforms such as Patreon, because I feel that you need to have a certain level of advanced energy or advanced practice in order to practice more complicated spells, and they are not necessarily all for beginners, and some of them are really intimate and only belong to the family. So this is also something that you have to understand about yourself, whether or not you want other people to read your book of shadows, you want to be part of a coven, or you prefer, like me, to be more as a solitary witch and share what you can share just in case, to teach future generation. This is also another thing that it's completely up to you, especially as an eclectic, lonely practitioner. If you want to know what type of witch you are, I have a dedicated, very detailed video here on this channel that you can check, and I will also make a pick a card called What Type of Witch Are You in the next videos, so you guys can find out. And for example, this is a spell that I shared on my YouTube channel that I wrote down called How to Enter People's Dream. So as you can see, this is what I do with my book of shadows. And the last spell that I wrote is something that I'm going to share on my Patreon next week, this week or next week, depending on when this video is going to be published, as well as other spells to remove like curses from the body or curses from the house. I also wrote down some of my favorite Solomon seals that I use, and so much more. And so guys, this is all about the book of shadows and how you can do it as well. You can do it as a website, you can do it digitally, you can buy a journal or a more sophisticated journal and write it down in section. I'm very simple, and I wanted to share you guys this story about the book of shadows, his origin, his importance, what was important in the book of shadows according for Gerald Gardner, and especially how you can create one just today with a simple journal that you love. Okay, you guys, this is the video that I had for you today. I hope you appreciate it. Subscribe to this channel to have more pica cards, spiritual videos, witches videos, and so much more. Join my Patreon to enter my Book of Shadows more in detail and for more detailed videos that I'm going to make about Aurelia, Stregoneria, Italian witchcraft, and all you need to know about witches. And see you on my next videos. And keep in mind, you're never wrong if you follow love. Bye!